Okay, I think we should probably begin now. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us today and coming to our free public lecture. My name is Dunia Garcia Ontiveros and I'm Head of Library and Museum Collections at the Society of Antiquaries of London. Now, before we begin with today's lecture, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Society. It was founded in 1707 at a meeting in a pub for the purpose of investigating and debating material remains of the past found in Britain. The Society was awarded a royal charter by King George II in 1751 and was thereafter charged with the encouragement, advancement, and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. In 1781, we moved into rooms in Somerset House, given to us by King George III. This allowed us to house and care for a growing library and museum collection. We moved to our current home, Burlington House, in 1874, and there we continue to focus on fellowship, conservation, research, and dissemination of our work. Today, we remain focused on those core objectives, and as a registered charity, we are committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public. We do this through public lectures, like this one today, public tours, exhibitions, scholarly research, seminars, and a program of publications. There will be a question and answer session at the end. If anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat function on Zoom and I will ask them at the end of the lecture. Please try to hold your questions until the end. Now, to today's business. We are delighted to have Dr. Charlotte Hedenstierna-Jonson presenting a lecture on her work on women in the Viking period for International Women's Day 2021. International Women's Day is now an actual celebration in our calendar, with our inaugural event last year to celebrate 100 years of female antiquaries. Today's lecture is called Active Men and Emblematizing Women, a reflection on agency, narrative, and interpretations in archaeological practice. Our speaker is Dr. Charlotte Hedenstierna-Jonson. Charlotte is a researcher and lecturer at the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History in Uppsala University in Sweden. Her main research interests cover martial society, networks, mobility, and cultural interactions in late Iron Age and Viking Age societies. Charlotte studied at the Archaeological Research Laboratory in Stockholm University and presented a doctoral dissertation in 2006 on the Birka warrior, the material culture of a martial society. She has a background in field archaeology and as a senior curator at the Swedish History Museum, and has held research scholarships both at the Swedish History Museum, Stockholm University, and the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum in Mainz. Charlotte has worked intensively on the Viking Age town of Birka, where she carried out 2 major research projects and participated in an infrastructure project related to the site. Particular focus has been on urban development and trade and its links to the organization of production and labor, explored through the study of mortuary behavior and burial practices, martial structures, and gender theoretical approaches to the archaeological record. Charlotte has previously been part of the interdisciplinary Atlas project, which combines studies of archaeology, physical anthropology, and genetics with the aim of unraveling the narratives of human prehistory within present-day Sweden. Charlotte currently holds a position as co-director of Sweden's largest archaeological research project, the Viking Phenomenon, which is based at Uppsala University. I will now hand over to Charlotte.
Thank you so much, and good day to everyone. It's a true honor to be invited to speak in this context, and slightly odd to be doing it from my youngest son's room, but I was graciously let to to use his room. If I promise to make his bed as well. So today's talk, and I will try and share my screen, is titled Active Men and Emblematizing Women. And it is not really about the now rather well-known warrior grave from Birka, but in a sense, and again, maybe it is, because the study of that grave became very much an unexpected journey, both for the research team as a whole, but also not least for myself. And what started out as a limited case study into a site and a material that I felt I was very familiar with, or so I thought, based on my experience both as a field archaeologist and researcher doing projects on Birka, in the end turned out to be a minefield as well as an eye-opener. But I would like to start, the case study in itself was all about one individual who an actual person, which I think we tend to forget when we talk about the past, that these were people that actually lived and had experiences and a life and eventually a death. And in this case, it was an individual who was buried in the first half of the 10th century in the context of the Viking town Birka. It was excavated over 900 years later in 1878 by famous Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe. And then in 2015, we started within the Atlas project that Dunia mentioned to examine and analyze the bones and the other objects in the grave, publishing a paper, a female Viking warrior confirmed by Genomics. And while the start of this, the 1930s to 50s individual that lived, as I said, was an actual person, in the end, the reaction and discussion following the publication of our paper was more or less mainly concerned with our contemporary views and our preconceptions rather than the grave itself or the person who it represented. So now I would like to start by introducing the team that was behind that study. This was a minor part of the Atlas project. The Atlas project was a great, extensive project that covered everything from Neolithic up until early medieval times, with the aim of mapping ancient genomics within present-day Sweden, so ancient individuals, asking questions of origin, mobility, migration, but also health and other interesting issues. So we were an interdisciplinary project covering archaeologists, osteologists, geneticists, and biologists. And I became the lead author on this particular case study, as I've spent a lot of time both on Birka and focusing on martial structures. And this was very much what had been interpreted as a warrior's grave. So it was closely linked to martial society. So what did we do within this case study? Well, we went back to the actual archaeology and the objects from the excavation. And as this was an 1878 excavation, everything is now kept in archives, both at the Swedish History Museum, where the objects are part of the collection, but also in the archives of Antikvarisk Topografiska Arkivet as part of the National Board of Heritage in Sweden. So we went back, we read everything that we could get our hands on. We looked for the original documentation, the field drawings, the many field drawings that Hjalmar Stolpe actually produced, his notebooks and his reports to the Royal Scientific Society. And of course, we also went into the collections and looked at all of the objects, again, measuring, exploring in several ways, and also seeing what was related to, or if all of the objects that Stolpe notes should be in the grave are still in the collections, which they were. Then the osteologist or the physical anthropologist within the Atlas project made new osteological assessments of the material, the skeleton from this grave. The grave is number 581 as noted by Stolpe. It's just a list with numbers of the graves he excavated, and he excavated a little more than 1,100 graves during his late 19th century excavations on Birka. So Källström and Storå, they reviewed all inhumation burials or inhumation graves from Birka to see if the material from this particular grave was what was supposed to be there according to Stolpe's original documentation, and did not really correspond to any other of Birka's graves. And this was the case. So we can also say that during this new review, Anna Källström again noted or made the assessment that this skeleton from an osteological point of view was a female skeleton. But as you all know, osteology will provide a good assessment, but it's not necessarily a determination. But I will get back to that. The skeleton was sampled for genetics, and the main sample was from a tooth. But as we wanted to secure skeletal integrity, as I said, this is an old material. It was excavated over 100 years ago, and with all excavations, not necessarily just because they are performed or were performed 100 years ago, but also when you have not been part of the excavation yourself, there is always this element of or this possibility of the bones getting mixed up. So we wanted to make sure that the skeleton derived from one and the same individual. So that's why we did double genetics testing from the tooth and the humerus, and it was a match. Now our questions concerning the skeleton was one, of course, if it was a man or a woman. And this was interesting because the grave very much look archaeologically like a male burial, but as Anna Källström's assessment of the skeleton was that it was a female, it would have been an interesting result either way. If the osteological assessment had proven wrong and this was a man, that would have been an interesting osteological question. But of course, it was also interesting for us to know if it genetically could be confirmed to be a woman, with all the implications for the interpretation of the grave that would bring with it. So the first, and that, making a sex determination for a geneticist is a very simple matter, so that there's very little, nothing to really get them excited. And they could confirm, and they compared the genome to other ancient materials, which of course is, you need to do that to get a more precise comparison rather than comparing it to modern day people. But still, in this case, it was a no-brainer. It was a biological woman. But then, of course, we also wanted to know as much as possible about this woman. So the region of origin was, of course, of great interest as well. And maybe we could, I want to start with saying that there is no such thing as a Viking gene, but there is, of course, a way of the genome of Northern Europeans tend to look in one way compared to, as you can see in the heat map to your left, to the genome of the Mediterranean area. And for this particular grave, marked here by the green star, the more red the comparative sample is, the closer it is in terms of genetics. So we can, more or less, we cannot say all that much about the genomic origins of this woman, but that she looks like a North European woman is kind of safe to say. What is interesting, and what would be interesting when we have the archaeological material from the grave in general, is that a plausible interpretation would have been that she could have had her origins somewhere in Slavonic areas, because the closest parallels to both the type of grave that she was buried in, but also the objects placed in the grave have the closest parallels are to be found in present-day Russia and the Ukraine. So there was a possibility that these particular graves might represent a population or individuals that came from, for example, Slavonic areas. But in this case, she proved to be Northern European. But we also compared her to a modern day Swedish population, and that is not really the same thing, but it's still an interesting comparison. And Birka is located in the county of Uppland, and the people in Uppland, present day people in Uppland, they have the genetic base that looks more or less like this. And you can see the red line for this grave that the Birka warrior was called, but still the grave in question. And she doesn't really look like modern day people from Uppland, but rather from the southern parts of Sweden. So these counties represent the southern provinces of Sweden. And one should be very careful when interpreting that. As I said, these are modern day Swedes, but if we bear that in mind, it has some bearing on the isotopes that we also, we took samples for strontium isotopes that then would indicate migration and mobility for this individual. And I won't go into the details, but the level of strontium reflects the kind of geological environment that you have been growing up in, as it is. If you sample the teeth that are formed during different ages, they will reflect the strontium levels of the geological environment that you lived in at that time. And you need a baseline, of course. So the Lake Mälaren region where Birka is situated has a very wide baseline because of the geological setting there. It's difficult to get it slimmer than this. But if you are born and spent your childhood and youth where your molars have been formed, you would have strontium levels looking like something within this baseline span. But the Birka grave, though buried in Birka, clearly shows that she was not born and raised in this area, but rather, and actually this corresponds to what we saw in the genetic comparison to modern day Swedes. This represents the southern parts of present day Sweden. But we can also see that between her 3 molars that we examined, there are differences in the strontium levels. So she has been moving around from birth up until her early teens at least. Then we don't have information on strontium levels, but we can still say that she continued to move about because she ended up somewhere here in the Lake Mälaren region. So we started with proper desktop archaeology. We went back to the original documentation. We went through the archives. We looked at the objects. We analyzed the skeleton with various scientific methods. And we published 2 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals of some standing and impact. And I thought we were done, at least after the first paper. But the reaction we got was somewhat unexpected. It wasn't really a discussion on the new findings or the discussion on what this could imply in terms of the grave itself, but rather what felt to us at least like an emotional reaction that it just couldn't be true. And this was an eye-opener for me. As we as scholars very often say that we try to convey that the Viking was not the template that we so often reproduce in drama series or in well, almost everywhere. It's very happening to discuss Vikings, and we try very hard to explain that they were people just like us. But when something out of the norm or out of the template actually appears, we are not really ready to accept it, but dismiss it as speculation. And why is that? So this is really what I want to talk about today, our perceptions and interpretations and how we use or how we read the archaeological material that we are studying. And I want to start here with the graves and the burials and the buried, because graves make up one of the main archaeological materials and constitute a vital source of information on the past. It's not only the grave itself, as you all know, and it's been used and seen as a collection of objects, but also the burial with what it reveals of social practice and religious rites. And set in a wider context, it also reflects the society and time in which the burial took place. And similarly, graves provide us with a direct connection to the people that actually lived in past societies through the skeletal remains and the various scientific methods we can apply to analyze them. The great challenge with mortuary archaeology is rather to define what or who the grave actually represents. The burial was a display to be experienced when it took place, and the grave became a monument to secure future commemoration, possibly both of the individual, but also of the event and the family or community that conducted the funerary ritual. It's highly unlikely that the participants in a burial during the Viking Age could foresee that the grave would be examined and deconstructed and interpreted many centuries later by archaeologists. But even if the construction and objects were never intended to convey messages to us, they were expected to be understood by the people of their own time, and possibly to create an event, the memory and meaning of which should be passed on to future generations. So they were creating a memory during the funeral. The different parts of a grave could thus be regarded as meaningful and intended to be read, not just by, or they didn't intend it to be read by us. So to my mind, the grave is a kind of puzzle. The number of pieces we try to put together. The individual pieces represents facts, but the puzzle in itself is an interpretation. The more pieces we have, the more nuanced the interpretation will presumably become. But in the end, it will never be complete. The various pieces also represent different types of information, making the interpretive process much more difficult. The grave, with its interred individuals, its grave gifts, and different social and religious practices, display what could be described as compartmentalized identities. And with that, I mean overlapping multiple identities that are visible through a distinctive material culture. While the objects may contribute with information on aspects concerning social roles and status, culture and affiliation, various practices linked to the burial may give an insight into the abstract world of ideas and cosmological beliefs in the past. The human remains contribute with information about, for example, lifestyle, age, health, diet, and biological sex. The parameters of a grave can be divided and defined in many ways, but just to illustrate, this is one of the most basic divisions that could be used. There is a site, location, context parameter that refers to a wider context in which the grave is situated and includes geographical location, regionality, topography, if it's a rural or urban site, but it also gives a chronological framework, both within the site and in comparison to other sites. Then there is the burial tradition or ritual. that covers different structural and practical elements of a grave and the burial. So is it a cremation or an inhumation? Does it have a superstructure or not? Do we consider it to be a local type of burial or a deviant kind of burial in the sense, etc. And finally, material culture is the parameter that has been most explored and with the longest research history, of course. And at times, the layout of a grave and the objects within it have been considered to directly communicate the role and social position of the interred, but at other times, the relation has been less direct or seen as less direct. But when the archaeological evidence has been recovered and stored and organized, the process of understanding what it communicates follows. So though springing from the archaeological source material in itself, the interpretation will inevitably be based on choices made during the collecting and sorting. It will also be affected by assumptions made and positions taken throughout the procedure. Is the buried local to the site or not? Do the objects in the grave represent the interred? And if so, are they symbols of an idealized existence or reflections of a life lived? The way we handle evidence, how we collect it, sort it, and assess it has a decisive effect on the interpretation. In taking a step back and reflecting on the choices made, we may ask ourselves what the archaeological evidence actually supports in terms of interpretation. At times, the addition of new knowledge to an existing archaeological context has rendered the established interpretation invalid. Key features that will change the complete interpretation of the material and rewrite the narrative can be seen as game changers, and their power as such needs to be accounted for. This does not need to be wrong. We just need to acknowledge that this is the case. For example, why is it that the whole understanding of a grave changes when the biological sex of the interred turns out to be something different than expected? And I've thought a lot about game changers. What is it that will actually change our view or our interpretation? One single fact, one single detail that will change our views on the complete grave as a complex. Gender apparently is one of these. The age of the person interred might be one. The background, if we find out that somebody buried with something that archaeologically looks very closely connected to one archaeological culture, but genetically turns out to be something else, would possibly be one. Chronology, if we find through dating that what we thought was a Viking Age skeleton turns out to be a Bronze Age skeleton, highly unlikely as that is, that might also be, of course, a game changer. But I'm sure that there are other game changers. And just to try to convey what I mean and to bring this into a greater story, as I will try at least to, by introducing you to 3 different burials and their interpretation. These are burials that have been excavated by Hjalmar Stolpe in Birka. And we will look at them from the perspectives of agency, narrative, and game changes. All of the 3 burials are considered to be represent an elite. They are so-called chamber burials, that is subterranean wooden chambers that have been filled with different types of grave goods. They are inhumations, which is interesting because the predominant burial custom in the Lake Mälaren region during most of the Viking Age is of course cremation. So this burial practice in itself represents something rather different, but it's also a burial custom that is closely connected to sites like Birka. So the closest parallels to chamber burials of this type have been found in similar Viking towns or towns during the Viking Age in present-day Russia and the Ukraine, sites like Gniestovo, Shestovitsa, Kiev, etc. And we will start by looking to our first example that concerns agency and the disparate level of agency given to men and women. Weights and scales, for example, have been retrieved from over 130 graves in Birka and are commonly interpreted as tools of trade. But while men buried with weights and scales are usually interpreted as merchants, women buried in similar circumstances are regarded as disconnected from active agency in this case, and are interpreted instead as merchants' wives or representing a family of merchants. Now, this is something that Norwegian archaeologist Anne Stadsberg noted early. In the 1990s, she wrote her first paper on this, and then she continued her studies, publishing several interesting papers on the same topic, and not just looking at the Birka burials, but also the situation in Norway and along the eastern trade route. But she could see that the distribution of tools of trade is rather equal between male and female burials, even with a slight overweight to the female burials. So is it plausible that there are more graves containing widows of merchants than actual merchants? Is this the most plausible interpretation? Well, it is possible, of course. You can make up all sorts of stories of merchants dying abroad and women being buried as widows, but connected to merchants. But being part of a merchant family, again, it's a plausible interpretation. But why is that then only? Why does that only concern women? Why doesn't men become buried as representatives of trading families as well as women? Why should we not assume that women took part in trading, as stated by Stadsberg? Interestingly enough, the women that have been buried with tools of trade quite often are also buried with tools of textile production or handling. So there is some kind of connection or possible connection between textile production or textile handling and tools of trade. So what would happen if we would apply the idea of compartmentalized identities on this grave 968 from Birka? Could this provide a tool for identifying multiple and overlapping information that in the end enable us to get a more nuanced interpretation of the burial? The grave is that of a woman, and it includes objects that, together with a chamber burial practice, indicate high social standing. Among the grave furnishings are 3 weights, all of different types, suggesting trading activities, and tools related to textile production. In this case, there's a needle case. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this is a needle case, and there is also shears in this burial. Isotope analysis on the skeleton of this grave have shown that the woman had a meat-based, that is, high-status diet, and that her pattern of mobility conforms to that of a relatively homogeneous group of female burials in Birka that all include tools of trade, and most of them tools of textile production. So a possible interpretation might be that the woman in this grave and a number of other high-status women in Birka held active and executive roles in trade with textiles within a shared geographical context. The gender bias that is discernible when interpreting the relation between the interred and the objects in a grave also affects the construction of the general narrative of the burial. The narrative provides a backstory through which the grave could be understood and clarifies the interpretation. Formulating a narrative provides the perhaps necessary contextualization, and may be considered an essential part of the interpretive process. But it also constitutes a risk, as the actual connection to the archaeological evidence tend to fall into the background. An example of this can be seen in a group of high-status burials in Birka. They are so-called double burials, including what has been assessed as one man and one woman based on archaeology, and here represented by the extremely well-furnished grave 644. The narrative of this grave is based not so much on archaeology as on Ibn Fadlan's account of the funeral of a presumably Rus chieftain in the region of the Volga Bulgars. It's noted that, like in the account, the buried merchant in 644 was accompanied in the grave by a woman. Whether a wife or a slave girl, the woman was dressed up and ritually killed. The knife was allegedly placed on top of her, supporting the interpretation that she had been stabbed to death during the funerary ritual. If we return to the archaeological evidence in the form of the grave plan as documented by Hjalmar Stolpe and the objects in the grave, there is nothing clearly supporting the given narrative, nor suggesting differences in status between the two interred. That the relation between the two individuals was unequal is still both possible and probable. But the contents and the spatial distribution in the grave does not reveal any such distinctions. Even the knife was found in another location than suggested. So then we arrive at the burial examined in the warrior study. The finding, as you know, sparked a debate that covered matters of agency, narrative, and mortuary behavior, as well as how we as scholars approach and interpret the archaeological material. And as it is a grave that is all about weapons and warfare, it has been, on very good grounds, interpreted as a warrior, a military, and even a political leader by a long number of scholars. These are good and valid interpretations, and not easy to change. So the first reaction to the new findings was rather, you must have the wrong bones. But when it sunk in that we actually did have the right bones and that the right bones still represented a biological female, the new reaction was rather, is this really a warrior? So suddenly the old interpretation was questioned. And rightly so. You can always discuss what you see in a grave, and weapons in a grave does not automatically mean that it is a warrior. But in this particular case, and for lots of different reasons, this is still a valid and very good interpretation that has to do both with the weapons in the grave, but also the general context and the location of the grave and what it looks like in comparison to other Birka graves. So behind this, is this really a warrior? A question that was never asked before we knew it was a woman was, to my mind, rather the question of, could a woman actually be a warrior? And this is, again, a valid and important question and something that we should be discussing, but we never really got to that. Instead, there were many ways of explaining why the grave was what it was, and they were surprisingly innovative and concerned both agency and narrative. When it came to agency, if this in fact was a woman that was a warrior, she must have been something quite out of the ordinary. There were questions of third gender, transgender, etc. We can say something about the biological sex. We can analyze the genomics. We can look for extra chromosomes, and we can also make an assessment of what she looked like from the skeleton, but we will never be able to say anything about a social, the gender roles as perceived in Viking society. We don't know if they were anything like the ones that we have the gender division that we see today, we can probably assume that it was different. But further than that, it's very difficult to reach. And it was also suggested that, okay, so then if she was a warrior, she must have been a she-woman of enormous in physical size and strength. Otherwise, she would not have been able to wield the weapons, for example. So what we can say there is that the osteology proves that she was actually quite tall. She was tall as a Viking man, but her features were feminine, and she looked very much like a woman. So then it was the question of the narrative. And this is where the really interesting suggestions came to my mind. She has been suggested to represent an absent husband. This is possible. Of course, everything is possible. They're very difficult or impossible to prove. But that she has been buried in someone else's place, a husband that was lost at sea or on campaign. It's similar to the interpretation that the women with tools of trade represented their husbands or their husbands' roles in life. But the great difference between the women with tools of trade and the woman in this grave is that the women with tools of trade, they are buried as women with women's clothing, with women or female jewelry. They are somebody in themselves, even if we interpret the tools of trade in the grave as representing somebody else rather than the woman herself. But in this case, there is nothing indicating any other type of personhood in the grave than what is connected to weapons and warfare. It's been suggested that she has been dressed up and buried in somebody else's clothes. Again, it's possible. We can never prove it. We can never not prove it, I'm guessing. But we have also been, the question has posed if there had been a second body that has been removed. And this again is possible. Nothing in the archaeology suggests a removed body. But what we can safely say is that yet another suggestion that there has been a second body in the grave that has completely decomposed, and the woman was placed directly over this completely decomposed male body, as it were. So she's been oozing into the clothes of the man. That we can safely say is not possible. So what happened actually? Returning to Hjalmar Stolpe, in 1889, little more than 10 years after he excavated 581, he published an article in the popular Ny Illustrerad Tidning, New Illustrated Journal, communicating his ongoing excavations at Birka. And with this article, Stolpe promoted his new attitude to archaeological method, explaining the steps of his meticulous documentation and the benefits they gave. Stolpe felt a great responsibility for future research and considered the archaeological methods generally used to be insufficient. Instead, he drew according to scale, on squared paper, introducing geological methodology into archaeology. And he produced a highly accurate representation of the grave. Initially, he was contested by more traditional archaeologists, but Stolpe's achievements made him one of the founding fathers of modern field archaeology in Sweden. Over time, archaeological method developed further, going from discovering the past to organizing the past in time and space, and to interpretations aiming at deeper understanding of past societies and the people that created them. Since the work performed by Stolpe and his contemporaries, we have come to expect a high level of accuracy and professionalism when it comes to adequate documentation of archaeological fieldwork. The documentation becomes the basis for the post-excavation process, as it should be, where the archaeological evidence is sorted, structured, set in context, and interpreted. I think we all agree that the level of accuracy and professionalism should be no less during post-excavation work, nor during the interpretive process that follows, than it was in the field. And it should be characterized by transparency and consistency, making it possible to trace the steps from interpretation back to the archaeological evidence. But in practice, the situation is not always that simple. We can, and again quoting Anne Stalsberg, ask ourselves why evidence that is visible in the archaeological sources have become invisible in the historical reconstructions and history books. The transformation from visible to invisible is not limited to women. Others have been written out of history as well. What happens in the process between discovering archaeological facts, that is, the artifacts and their contexts, and creating the narrative of how the material should be understood? The archaeological excavation provides us with facts. We don't always understand the facts, but we can return to the facts. And based on the facts, we lay the puzzle, we interpret as best we can. But an interpretation can, should, and most likely will be tested, discussed, and perhaps altered. An interpretation should not be confused with a projection, where the interpretation, rather than being based on the facts, is based on preconceptions often tainted by our contemporary glasses and our own ideas about the past. This is very easy to detect when we look at, in this case, portraits of Viking women from the Bayreuth opera. But we can see equal projections in our own school books. This is from the 1980s, so it's a bit dated. Even if this looks more or less accurate, why is there only one woman in the picture? Why are all the other tasks performed by men? And why is she cooking in her Sunday best with her brooches and her keys, while the men are actually wearing more appropriate attire? So this is also a projection and something that we should be aware of. So I would like to end, as I started, with the scientific achievements of Hjalmar Stolpe. Through his meticulous efforts in the field and his attitude of responsibility towards future research, we have the possibility to go back, use the facts that he secured, and make new, groundbreaking, provocative research, asking questions no one could even anticipate at the time of excavation. And to my mind, that is truly great archaeology and true science. Thank you. Can I just add one thing? At the bottom of the screen, there is a link. If you are at all interested in Birka and you want to see Stolpe's original documentation and his drawings, etc., they are all online, courtesy of the Swedish History Museum, and free to use. So please explore if you're interested. Thank you. So should I stop sharing, perhaps?
Thank you so much for that, Charlotte. We've got quite a few comments actually saying, thank you, Charlotte, great talk. Congratulations, a great lecture. And we also have a few questions. So I'll start with the first one. This is from Roberta Gilchrist, and she would like to know whether the skeptical response to the interpretation came from the academic community or from the media. Do you think the response was prompted by a challenge to perceptions of gender and power in the Viking Age, or rather to the perceived connection between Viking masculinity and Swedish cultural identity today?
Oh, that was a big question, and it's a good question. To be really honest, I'm still trying to understand the reaction. We were not at all prepared for that kind of reaction. We anticipated that there would be some comments and discussions, and that we would get like 5 minutes of Swedish radio time for the presentation. But in our eyes, it was a case study and nothing more. Interesting in itself, and particularly to someone like me who's been studying the martial structures of this particular site. But the more I've thought about it, and I think possibly it has, the reaction came both from some academia and the general public, as it were, and a lot of it was very supportive as well. So it's not just a negative response. But I think it was, one part of it, I think, actually has to do with interdisciplinary studies. I think that we are not as prepared for those as we think. And we speak very different languages when we present results, for example. And as a true representative of the humanities, I'm not really a scientist in that sense. We are always used to being able to negotiate interpretations. I mean, there's nothing is written in stone. You can suggest something, and then you can work with that as a suggestion. But when you have a result from the natural sciences, it's a hard fact in a different way. It doesn't represent the truth or the whole truth in any sense, but it's very difficult to negotiate man or woman in a biological sense. And we need to rephrase our questions and interpretations relating to that piece of hard fact. And I think that part of what was provocative, I think, had to do with that rather than anything else. But then I also think that we all have our way of interpreting the past. And if you are a scholar within Viking studies, of course, you've been working with your interpretation of the past for a long time, so it's difficult to negotiate that. And new pieces of information always takes time to settle in, because they mean that we need to look at other things, not just this particular piece of information, but maybe the general picture. So I think that might be part of it as well. And what I must say I'm mostly proud of in this during this complete journey is that I can see that there is a new way of acknowledging that our interpretations are interpretations rather than facts, and that we need to be slightly a bit more careful in how we construct our interpretations. We can still go with the same ones, but we need to explain why. So I think that's, but again, I'm still contemplating why this particular thing was so provocative. I can find that I'm guessing again that if this would have been presented a century ago, I don't think it would have been as provocative. I think that there were 2 graves in Norway that in 1901 were published as women warriors or Valkyries, and that was wow, but not provocative. So I think that our perception of gender roles and possibly even more what martial society and warfare stands for is different from, I mean, it was a long time we were at war, especially in Sweden. So I think that we have a romantic idea of who can participate or should participate in warfare. And that is a luxury that you don't have in a martial society.
Thank you. Actually, that brings us on nicely to the next question, which is, do you have your own favorite theory about who the woman from the warrior burial was?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we're really not on a personal basis, but I was excavating in the garrison, which is closely, I mean, it's situated in direct contact to this grave. And it was an active garrison during the life of this woman and during when she was buried. And when we excavated, we were always joking about finding the general in the garrison, and we never did. So just for fun, I would suggest that she's the general, but that's not really serious. But what I do think is that the Viking Age to me is a society where the individual is of less importance than the context. I mean, the family or the group that you are part of, that defines you much more than who you are as an individual. And with that said, they were, like us, they were very aware of if it was a woman or a man, and personal characteristics or traits, of course, but those were not the first thing that defined you, but rather that you possibly came from a family that was expected to have this position. And for some reason, she was the one that fitted the part at this particular time. So either there was a lack of a male representative, or she was the best representative because she had personal traits that had proven her the best one. That we will never know. But to me, I'm quite sure that she belonged to a family of politically or military leadership, or people that were expected to have that kind of position. And there are very interesting parallels in Europe at the time with women who are, for different reasons, filling that role. So Gerberga in Saxony, and Ethelfled and Emma of Burgundy. And what they all have in common is that they are the sister of someone, or the daughter of someone, or the wife of someone. And I think that this is the way we should understand this woman as well.
Thank you. The question from Rob is there anything from BJ 581 to suggest anything about the muscle structure of the buried woman which may suggest being stronger? That being said, as a reenactor, I know that the weapons and equipment don't take a large amount of strength to wield well. He also says thank you for the talk.
This, again, that's a very practical and nice question. As I said, she was as tall as a Viking man, so she's in her 1.70 something. The skeleton is well preserved according to Birka standards, but it's not well preserved. So it's more of a, if you can imagine crackers being wet and then drying up again, that kind of structure. So it's difficult to see all the information that you would really want to find. But what we can say about the weapons, because we've had lots of experts look at the weapons, they are actually made to fit her. So the weapon is balanced, the sword is balanced so that most of the weight is in the hilt, for example. The axe is also very light, very deadly, but it's still, so they are high-tech weapons, and they are suited for her. And the arrowheads are the particular piece of resistance, according to the smith, Peter Jonson, who's been looking into those. They are really, I mean, the fighter plane of their age. So and again, fitted to somebody of her constitution. So I think that speaks in favor, actually, of her being an active warrior. But nothing on the skeleton that we can say.
Okay, I think you may have answered this already, but I'll just read it out. Vicky Harley asks, did skeleton 581 show signs of muscle development due to strenuous activity or pathology either that could be due to fighting or general physical activity, for example, arthritis?
And this is not my area, so I'm a bit careful, but what we can see is that there is, her spine shows evidence of wear in a way that has been interpreted as she being seated in the saddle riding for most of her life, but at the same time also being active with her hands. So that could indicate using her weapons from horseback, for example, but that's a possibility. It's not a certainty. We do have the jaw, but we don't have the skull. The skull was found in the excavation, and where it is now, we don't know. We think it's in an anatomical collection somewhere, because that is what they did in the late 19th centuries. So we hope that it will eventually appear. And there is, of course, there's a possibility that there will be traces of the trauma to the skull. But again, even if we would find a big hole in the skull, it doesn't, to my mind, really prove that was, I mean, it doesn't have to be violence due to battle. Violence comes in many forms. And so, to be honest, we don't exactly know what the skeleton of a warrior should look like. We can see that warriors that have been performing, that have been archers, mainly have been archers, they have indications on the skeletons of enlarged muscles and so on. But if she was not, she did have archery equipment, but if she was the person that we think she was, she would have been able to use all her weapons, and that would be more evenly distributed over the body. So I don't think that we would see as typical traces as from an archer on her body. And again, people that work with their body, like a warrior, could also have been a farmer. So it's, again, it's difficult to say exactly how they have been using their body.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions. We just have more thanks. Heather Sabir, who is the Honorary Secretary of the Society, had to leave at 2, but she said, thank you so much, very interesting, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. So I think this was the perfect talk for today, Charlotte. It's absolutely fascinating. Chris, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Just to thank Charlotte very much for that. And to observe that within my own area of study, which is early medieval England, 5th to 7th or 8th centuries, we have had exactly the same intellectual phenomenon, which is wealth in a male or a male gendered context is considered indicative of agency. Similar symbolism in a female context or a female gender is considered emblematic. And that's a mindset that we have to break out of. We have to start accepting the evidence of other sources and the evidence of common sense in societies where everybody had a role which was important, and accept that women did have agency. And in some cases, it was serious political, economic, and military agency. So I completely agree with everything Charlotte has said on that aspect. It was brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we all leave, I just wanted to remind everyone that our next public lecture is tomorrow. So that's Tuesday, 9th of March at 1 p.m. And the topic is the Reverend Joseph Hunter, FSA, and the Legend of Robin Wood. And this will be by Dr. David Crook, FSA. Our full spring event program is live on our website and bookings are open. All our events are free and open for anyone to join. I would encourage you all to sign up to Salon, our fortnightly e-newsletter, and you can do so through our website, where you will find information on upcoming events at the Society and news from the sector. Just again, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was wonderful.
Thank you for having me.